All right, so finally, aside from our IUPAC rules for amines, naming amines, and our secondary, tertiary common naming system, we also have those aromatic amines from before. So we already actually discussed these. We can very briefly overview this initial part. Remember, if it's not just a cycloamine, if it's a aromatic amine, and you have that NH2 amino group attached to it, we had a special name for that before. This is just called aniline. So nothing changes, it's still aniline. You can have branches off that aniline and then you just name it appropriately. Remember, I could have something like this, and I would just call it a O-fluoroaniline. So nothing changed. It's still just an aniline. You don't have to classify it since it is an aniline. It would be primary in this case, right? These would both be primary. And you don't have to say O, you can say 2, but I usually say O, so you just need to be aware of that, right? It is off of the second carbon. This would be the 1 automatically. This is the 2. So you can say 2-fluoroaniline, but also O-fluoroaniline. You have the O, M, and P options from before. So we should remember how to do that. That shouldn't be a problem. But there are actually secondary and tertiary versions of aniline, and those get a little funky. We do have to discuss those quickly. All right, so if it's going to be secondary, I'd have to have another branch off of my nitrogen. So I'd have another carbon over here. Right, and I have to know how to name this appropriately. Remember, I'd probably have a hydrogen on here too, as long as this is secondary. But I'm going to name branches, but I'm still going to call it aniline. So I'm going to call this a methyl branch, but I have to be careful. Because if I say methyl aniline, you would assume it's an aniline like this, and I'd have a methyl group off of it somewhere else, off of the ring somewhere. Now, to differentiate, if I had it off the ring, I would call this one on the right an O-methyl aniline or a 2-methyl aniline versus an M or a P or 3, 4, whatever you want to say. But this one on the left, I need to be able to label this methyl aniline appropriately so I know that it's secondary. And the way that you do that is instead of putting a number for the carbon or a letter that's appropriate for those carbons, the OMP positions, you're actually going to put an N here. Right? If I have an N-methylaniline, that means that the methyl is attached to the nitrogen itself, so that automatically tells you that it's a secondary amine, right? And you could name it appropriately. So N-methylaniline would be appropriate for this. I could also have a situation where it's tertiary, so I'm going to adjust this picture over here, just erase some things. You can just redraw something in your notes if necessary. So it could be tertiary as well. Maybe I have something like this. So I have 3 things branched off of that nitrogen. Again, I'm still going to call it an aniline. And I just have branches off of that nitrogen. So I'm going to say N-ethyl, N-methyl aniline. Can't fit methyl in there, so I'm just going to put it down below. But it'd be an N-ethyl, N-methyl aniline. Right? So if it's going to be secondary or tertiary, you have to know how to name that branch appropriately. We're still going to want to call it aniline like we did before. You just have the branch off of the nitrogen instead of a specific number, or using that letter designation like in the past. If you have 2 of the same thing off of that nitrogen, so let's say I change this a little bit. Again, you just have to redraw it. I don't have the luxury of that. But if I made those 2 things methyls, I'd have to call this a dimethyl aniline, and then I'd have to have an N in front of it. because I still have to know where both of those methyls are attached, and they're both attached to a nitrogen. So you need to make sure you have two ends, just like we had to have two numbers before if we had a dimethyl, right? Even if it's the same number, you have to use it twice. So be careful with those. Otherwise, secondary, tertiary, not that difficult, but that is the one new thing when you're talking aromatic amines. So hopefully, because of the fact that part of it's review, where you already knew how to name these two, that should be easy. But the new stuff, the secondary and tertiary, you're going to have to adjust and just add that into your vocab. All right.